Yes.
Yes.
Board adopt the meeting minutes.
AJ,
Yes.
Scott, Angie,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Andy, Nick,
Yes.
Kimberly,
Yes. Study session, agenda?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you all for being here so early on August morning. As you'll know, typically don't have an August study session, or a July study session for that matter. It's a little different this summer. So here in August, we wanted to incorporate a study session for Emory and David. We wanted to bring back our board professional learning, where we've done several different things over the years, book studies, discussions, presentations along the way. If you'll recall, one of our last board retreats started a conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. This work's been going on in the district over the course of the last several years. Most recently, as of July 1st, we welcomed a new position in the district as our Chief Equity Officer, held by Dr. Andre Dixon. So what we wanted to do this morning is to reconvene that conversation at the board table as far as professional learning, with a little bit of a follow-up from our last conversation held at our retreat. Recall, we talked about frames and lenses, and how we approach equity, both as we self-reflect in terms of our own upbringing and perspective, and also the work that we do in our respective roles. So we're going to ask Dr. Andre Dixon-Seahorn to come and take a few minutes, walk us through some questions that she's been utilizing as part of her entry plan, working with leaders across the system, across the district, and also bringing that to the forefront with our board. Allow you to have the opportunity to reflect, share a little bit. For the mic. Welcome, Dr. Dixon.
Good morning, everybody. How are we today? This screen is 304. I want to pull something up here on the screen for everyone. It's telling me it's currently used. Do I need to? How do I? Okay. Let's try it again. Okay, so good morning again. All of you should have received, as of yesterday morning, some questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those questions were an integral part of the equity talk sessions that we have been having with every single cabinet member, director, school leader across our organization. And the purpose for those questions was really to just kind of recall the work that we've been doing for really about the past 4 or 5 years here in public schools. So of course, long before I arrived here. And really just trying to get my finger on the pulse of where are we really with respect to our equity work? And where are we really within each department? Where are we at the cabinet level? Where are we amongst directors and school leaders? Because everybody's in a different place. And so as we were having these conversations, I had an epiphany and realized that there's another very important sector of this organization that we need to include in these conversations, and that would be the governance level with you as board of directors. So the reason you got the questions, what could appear to be in the last minute, is so that you did not have time to prepare to answer the questions. Because the equity talk session, you're giggling under there, you feel it, right? And so with the equity talk sessions, I did not release the questions in advance to anyone, because I did not want to receive any scripted answers. I really wanted to feel in the moment what people were saying, what they were thinking, what they were feeling. And so I just wanted to very quickly just kind of share with you how we kind of created what we're going to refer to as the brave space for these kinds of conversations to be held on the beginning of this work, but then also for continuing this work. And so one of the texts that I believe I've shared with you that I have been reading, it's kind of a field guide, if you will, is this text here that's on the screen, Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. And so Cobb and Crownapple, they are the authors of this work. And really the premise of what they're writing about is how do we create inclusive cultures within an organization so that everybody can feel an integral part of the work that's being done, and so that we can get further along in the work. And so as they were really presenting this idea of creating a brave space, there's a framework that they have in there centered around the dispositions of dignity. And we've heard the word dispositions before around visible learning and the work we've been doing there. So automatically that was a connector for me. Dispositions of dignity. Well, what are they? And as I was sharing and having the dialogue with every single leader in this organization, we started out with this. And I really asked them, is this something that you can live with? Is this something you can agree to? Is this something we can all adhere to in terms of these dispositions? Can we all center ourselves around this work on equity in an attitude or spirit of empathy? Empathy being that different perspectives are going to be shared. And how do we allow those perspectives to be shared without judgment and ridicule, right? Patience. How can we really meet every single person, particularly leaders in this organization, at their point of need and help to bring them along around Dr. Tucker's vision of where we're going with equity work, with your full-fledged support and endorsement? And that idea is really about, you think about the old fable about the tortoise and the hare. You know, slow and steady wins the race. Well, this isn't a race, but this is work that we have to do very steadily, very consistently, very strategically. Openness is going to be key. That's another tenet that's created that allows us to create brave spaces. Openness in terms of there's a point and there's a place where we all have to be vulnerable. There's a point and the place where we all have to just be transparent and we have to be truthful. And I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. There comes a moment for all of us in this work that has to happen, but it can't happen if we're not open, right? And then the last tenet of this work is listening. Oftentimes it's easy for us to listen, but then already have in our minds what we want to say back. But this is not the kind of listening we're talking about now. This is listening where we truly seek to understand where others are coming from, right? And so we started out our work around that. And then we went into, for the others, 9 questions. You only had 8. And so I tried to keep it at as high of a level as possible without getting in the weeds. And so the first question was around just when you hear diversity, the word diversity, what comes to mind? And many of you have already responded to that question. And really what we were after was just what does diversity look like within the context of our larger school community, right? We all know diversity is not just about race. So we can just say that, address the elephant in the room, right? And we understand it's bigger than that. But what does it look like here in Liberty, okay? The next question you received was around equity. It's such a big word. Like, what does it really mean? So what does it mean to you, right? And ultimately what we'll get to do as we compile all the data is we'll really be able to frame what we mean when we say equity here in Liberty Public Schools. The next question is around inclusion. And it's a loaded question, right? But it's really after how prevalent are issues of, I say inclusion here, but really it's about exclusion. Or what about the sense of not belonging? How prevalent is that in our school organization? And so I had to ask every leader, have you had to deal with issues where something came up where someone said, I don't feel included, I don't feel like I belong? And then how did we respond to that? Because see, that goes back to the listening part, right? The next question was around what makes you feel comfortable, and comfortable in the sense of confident, competent at doing the work and addressing issues when they come up. This helps us to understand what are our strengths here in Liberty Public Schools. We've been on this journey now 4 or 5 years. Surely we've gotten good at something, right? And so this helps to understand what are we feeling pretty confident about as we address equity issues of concern. The next question, being the inverse of that, what makes you uncomfortable? What makes you, when the issues come up, you go, oh gosh, I don't know about that one. I don't know, right? What makes us feel not so confident or competent when we're addressing issues that come to the surface? And so this helps us to understand, what additional supports do we need? What additional resources? What additional training? What kind of professional learning do we need? Our next question centers around, what are, and I asked this question a little bit differently for you as board leaders, what are the opportunities for developing our professional learning? This is really helping me to understand what are some things that we can begin working on at the governance level. And so that's why I asked you, what do you believe individually? What do you believe is the most important equity-focused area that as board of directors we need to learn about? Okay? Because we're all on a continuous cycle of improvement. We're all devoted to learning, particularly being in an education organization. The next question, which equity-related issue has, from your perspective, been the greatest challenge for Liberty Public Schools? This is looking over the banister at the system. What are some things from a systems view keep coming up as challenges that we know at some point, hey, we got to deal with that. We really got to take a closer look at that, right? And so as we address that thing or those things, whatever they are from your perspective, that is what can help us as an organization begin to lead to transformative change, right? And so that's why that question was posed. The next one, any additional questions you may have about having an equity-focused, equity-centered strategic plan, what additional questions or comments do you have about that? That was posed so we can get at how do we better align the work we're doing with the strategic plan. In other words, we're not just doing things just to be doing them, but they have a very strategic purpose. So these questions were posed to you, and if I do not have your responses yet, I'm just asking if you can get those to me no later than today. I want your answers to be candid, just raw, just whatever the answer is for you. And again, when we go back to thinking about creating the brave spaces, the brave space starts here at the governance level. And then it transcends to the cabinet level. And then it transcends throughout the entire organization. As I've been having the equity talk conversations, it came to me that, you know, those that follow our leadership, they can't go where we won't grow. And so I just wanted to just kind of come back to you because I realized that we had not put the questions out there for you, and you are an integral, critical part of this organization and setting the direction for where we go in our equity work. And so if you have any questions or comments, I'll entertain those at this time. I do want you to know that I'm in the process of compiling all the data, as I did put in the weekly update. And my goal is that by the time we have our next board meeting, that I can have an update of kind of what that data is beginning to look like and how it's speaking to us as an organization. You know, I tried to think of what would Scott ask me.
Yeah. How many equity talks have you held?
I have held approximately 50. So it could be 49, 51. I just lost count after about 40. Yeah, so about 50, leaders across the entire organization.
Are you observing any trends?
You know I am, but I have to keep it top secret for now.
You're observing.
I am. I'm seeing some trends, and so that is why I wanted to get at kind of where we need to grow so that we can just begin tackling that. But yes, I am seeing some trends, positive trends, and some areas where we can work on for sure.
That's a follow-up presentation.
Absolutely, follow up. Right, not today.
Any thoughts or reflections, questions?
Did anyone want to weigh in at all on maybe how the questions impacted you?
Really thought of either way. Really, what equity is, including all of so raw and what this brings to equity. So it really is a challenge. And
enable. Look at it from that experience, very different than the sitting there in the center. So I appreciate you including us in the conversation. Different viewpoint, we obviously got to be advocates for.
Anyone else? All right,
I
thank
would-
you.
I
Oh.
would add, thank you, Sherry, both from a workplace standpoint and from a history standpoint. When I was sitting down with Dr. Dixon, she made me schedule a time with her. We took the full hour, and so she grilled me. But one of the questions was around, what are the goals? If we could do anything, what would we want to try to accomplish? So to layer another part into that workplace, school district, beyond that, community standpoint, what would it look like? This type of conversation was embedded and threaded throughout the entire, not just the footprint of Liberty Public Schools, Liberty, Kansas City, the region, metro. We have coming up on Thursday, on the 6th, a panel that Dr. Dixon participating through Suburban Baptist that asks some difficult questions. But it's a community, broad, metropolitan, regional conversation. So I think that's where my head is. So not just within businesses, but places, certainly within schools, but a broad communication. to ensure that we have some- Thank you, Dr. Dixon.
Thank you.
What is reflected on the screen is a series of definitions, aspirations that we developed over the course of the last couple of years. You might have seen this from time to time. We brought it forward with our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. But I think over the course of this last month, equity talks that Dr. Dixon has had, engaging with the board on a couple of occasions, and subsequently, we want to bring this back, revise it, tweak it, because it's going to be continuing to grow and evolve over time. Clearly identifying what we mean by those terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, what those aspirational pieces are as we think about our strategic plan, what we've accomplished, what our data tells us, where we need to go. So this will be somewhat of a guiding document as we think about the work that we do. A companion piece that I wanted to bring forward as well before we leave this topic of professional learning is this idea of navigating polarities. And there's no shortage of opinions and perspectives these days. I was actually at a commencement event, graduation over the weekend in Springfield, and it was for an international online school. There were only 3 graduates. 2 of them were from Africa. 1 of them was from Argentina. And one of the commencement speakers, who was a good friend of mine, who actually grew up in the same country that I grew up in, Burkina Faso, started her commencement address with this excerpt, and you might recognize it. It simply says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in a superlative degree of comparison. Obviously, the opening to Tale of Two Cities, if you recognize that. But what a great introduction to this notion or idea of polarity, where you have competing issues that have varying perspectives. And so as we think about this framework, just to kind of walk through it, we looked at this about a year ago with our board at a retreat. We also worked on this with our district leadership team. And it really has 2 portions to it. Look at the top side. It speaks to this notion of the upside of differing perspectives. So choose an issue. Choose the perspectives, one on one side, one on the other, for or against. But then what you end up seeing is that both of those perspectives have an upside and a downside. And as you walk through the framework in and of itself, the upside speaks to questions that include what are the values and opportunities from both perspectives. Beyond that, what action steps can be taken to achieve the values identified, again, from both perspectives. Secondly, what actions or steps can be taken to achieve the opportunities attributed to both perspectives. On the downside, a consideration within the framework brings about what blind spots or fears potentially exist. Similarly, you ask the question, what are the early warning signs of blind spots? Followed by, what are the early warning signs of potential fears or issues that might arise? As you work the framework, you identify the positive pieces of both perspectives. You identify kind of the negative piece, which is really the blind spots or those fears. But then by navigating that framework, our hope is that you come forward with a series of action steps to be able to move the values and opportunities of both perspectives forward, while at the same time identifying what those fears or blind spots are attributed to both perspectives. Maybe this is a good framework in the day in which we live. There are some specific pieces, though, that I think apply to the work that we do as a board. Some examples that I thought of would be obviously navigating a pandemic. Who's done that before? I don't think any of us have, but perhaps this framework assists with that. Or even navigating social.
I know what it's like now.
100 years ago.
I know what it's like now.
Navigating social and racial justice issues, considering the economic impact of where we're at presently, an upcoming election, as far as a presidential election that is proving to be contentious. And so really the question for us is, how do we respond? How do we respond as a district? How do we respond as a Board of Education from a governance standpoint? And so I wanted to frame that in two ways. Sometimes it's things that happen around us. And so how do we respond? We always listen. In addition to the listening piece, perhaps we message, whether it's administration messaging something out broadly to the community, or perhaps it's the Board of Education messaging something out broadly to the community. We've done that before. Additionally, perhaps there's a position that's taken by a board, whether it's in favor of a particular path as we navigate those frameworks, or maybe it's even opposing something that we don't believe is beneficial for our community. The other instance is when perhaps things occur within our system. So if things are occurring within our system, sometimes there may be a student issue that surfaces that we need to attend to or address. Perhaps there's a staff issue or curricular or an instructional issue. Other times it might be operational. Operational in the sense that as you see across the country and racial issues that are going on across the nation, maybe it's a statue, maybe it's a mascot, maybe it's a building name, something to that effect. So as we think about these and we struggle with these issues, they can be polarizing, but yet I think there's a framework for us to be able to navigate that moving forward. The reason I leave this here is just that I think it fits with the conversations that Dr. Dixon Seahorn is having, because oftentimes those can be contentious issues, but at the same time beyond that, when we look at the pandemic, when we look at economic uncertainty, when we look at social justice issues, inevitably it lands at the governance table and causes us to reflect on what we do, be able to have those difficult conversations in brave spaces as we continue to move our community forward and support the work on behalf of our kids. I just wanted to revisit that this morning, certainly open it up for any thoughts or reflections before we move on throughout the remainder of the agenda. Not this morning. Just those examples. Yeah, that's follow-up. Any thoughts or reflections this morning?
I think this is an interesting framework, kind of in the spirit of don't go so fast that you don't think deeply about these kinds of issues. But it's fascinating to me how 1 week we could be looking at something like this with a fairly balanced view. Another week we may look at it with an emphasis on the values, is what we were trying to be about. And then another week things change. The same facts are on the table, but you could shift to working out of fear heavily. And so I think it's helpful to take the time to move through things and try and find the right way forward.
And I think we've learned that as well, and sometimes we hurry to quickly develop something or a response to something, whereas, to your point, sometimes it's better to go slow and kind of navigate those issues, be able to reflect how we move forward on it. Yeah, good point. Other thoughts, reflections?
I would just say, I think that we have a couple of specific issues that we had talked about working through with these, so we'll need to look back on those in our next study session.
Yeah.
Okay. You give me the floor?
What's that, I'm sorry?
Are you giving me the floor?
No, you can have it,
Can
but.
I think that this learning experience that we've had this morning leads right into what a topic that I would like us as a board to talk about. I have, having conversations about this Confederate monument at Fairview Cemetery in Liberty. I was talking to some Liberty patrons, school members, people who live in the community, shared with me that what is the Liberty School District going to do about Alexander Donovan's Elementary? After all, it's named after a slaveholder. And as I reflected on that, I thought that is something that we as a board need to look at. Sometimes we don't look in our own backyard. And I don't say I had the complete answers, but I think one of the things that we have to begin to think about is something that we may have valued at some point in time doesn't clearly fit today's standards in today's world, and we need to think about that and talk about it and find ways to address it and to discuss it and to find solutions. And so I think that's something that can be relevant to what we just talked about this morning. I recognize that names, monuments, and there a lot of money is invested in those things, and so they reflect our values. They're symbolic, but they have importance and they have impact. And I think that at this point in time, we need to evaluate and assess: do we want our schools? Do we want the now? Don't get me wrong. I've been looking at Alexander Donovan. He's a complex individual, but at the same time, he was a slaveholder, and we need to give serious consideration to that. And I think, from my perspective, A.J. Bird's perspective, of being an African American in this community, that slavery is truly our first sin. And when are we going to step up and really say, no longer as a nation, we're going to tolerate anything that's relevant, and we're going to get rid of all the vestiges that contribute to that and to that kind of thinking. We've got enough enemies in the world that we're not united. And if you watch, until we address this, it will continue to rise. And our status in the world is being reflected in this. We didn't win the Cold War based on war as a weapon. We won it based upon people believing in the concept of democracy that we profess. And if we really fulfill those, every time we repeat this Pledge of Allegiance, it's just the powerful portion of it that if it was so true, if it was in so much truth to it, how powerful a nation we would be and be united. I want to give others, of course, I'm encouraging others to speak to this. And I know it's not an easy solution. We could ignore it, we could walk away. But we need to face it head on. If we're going to expect our school district to really come and be about what it's going to be about, we're going to have to demonstrate it as a leadership. Policy. Behavior follows policy. Last year, when there was an incident in the school about racial slurs and how a teacher handled the situation and the use of the N-word, the board stepped up and put policy in place. And there's other things working there, but it made a difference because we didn't have, at least I'm aware of, any major incidents like occurred last year, and we continue to make the news regarding that. Just need to think and talk about it. Thank you.
So,
Yeah, I think that's an example
Right.
of, if you look at how you've kind of quartered this out, that's one of the things that falls under opportunity.
Mhm.
What I'm looking for, and I mentioned this in some of my answers to the questions that Andrea presented earlier, I'm looking for us to find specific things that we can address and not assume that we can fix things with these overarching policies. Because I think policy is one thing. I mean, I honestly don't believe that we haven't had another incident because of the policy. I do believe that if there's another incident similar to that, now we have a policy that addresses it. But I really don't think that people say, oh, the school board implemented a policy, so we can't do that anymore. That's not really the way life works. I'm looking to your point, I hope to our point, that this is one of those specific opportunities we can address as we move forward. Because I'm looking for specific things that we can stand shoulder to shoulder on and address as a group, as opposed to, again, these watered down policies that we think are going to affect the entire organization. Policy really doesn't do that. We've got to look for specifics that we can address and say, we're going to fix this. And I think that's an example of one of those things. It may be.
so let's put it on for the next study session to work through the framework, specifically in relation to Alexander Donovan, which also will give everyone time to do some study of him and the issue. And maybe Dr. Dixon-Horn can help us.
There's
facilitate
another
that.
piece to that, to Scott's point, within board policy. So board policy specifically spells out how to navigate facility questions that arise in and around school names and so forth. Not only on the front end, whenever you're building a campus and electing a name, then also assessing that, specifically working through committee structure. So there may be an opportunity to follow that board policy piece, and we can bring that forward as well in respect to that. So certainly at the next study session, we'll pull the policy forward so you all can see that and what that entails, that then can kind of chart a course moving forward.
But to AJ's point and to Dr. Dixon Seahorn's point, if we're really going to make change in our organization and in our community, it's time to make some good trouble. So let's have those conversations.
And I think Alexander Donovan, just throwing it out there, that's the tip of the iceberg. Franklin is Benjamin Franklin. Lewis and Clark, I mean, I don't know how far we want to go with some of these issues. I'm not sure how far we should go with some of these issues. But I do know we have a board policy now that doesn't allow us to name buildings after people.
But it starts with us having the conversation.
For some of those reasons, right?
For these reasons.
Right.
So it may not just be that one building, it may be more.
Well, let me say this. That's what our constituents brought to us, Alexander Donovan. We as a board could deal with that alone and not have to go any further,
Well,
unless that demand was made of us. The
True.
question is not-
True.
The question is not where we
Yeah.
stop, the question is where we start.
Absolutely, yeah. And you're right, AJ. I mean, it
That is
starts with
specific.
addressing Alexander Donovan, but I do think you have to look at all of them. So I'm not saying we got to wait till all of them come together, right? I mean, Alexander Donovan's the one that needs to be addressed out of the gate,
Okay.
for sure. But I do think you got to look at them all.
But we do need a process and a plan for
And-
doing it in a way that's
And that sits in
organized and
policy.
systemic.
So I think if we can start by reviewing board policy, then that'll give the board something to start from, and pulling a select group of individuals together for the committee structure. And that we've looked at that policy attributed to naming. So if you'll think through what I shared in terms of those three examples, whether it's a statute, like what we see, a statue over at the cemetery, whether it's mascots, we're not necessarily dealing with that in our district. We know of other districts that are, and making or having conversations at the board level in terms of whether or not they rename their high school mascot. And then the third piece would be on the facilities side, as we talked about this morning. We may find other pieces. The other thing that I would cause us to reflect on would be, what board policies do we have in place that perhaps we need to approach through a different set of lenses that we've not done before. And so think of a policy audit. That isn't a huge undertaking, but at the same time, if we're truly thinking about the diversity, the equity, and inclusion pieces, how do we approach board policy with the intent of ensuring that they do include not just those three terms or have those three lenses in place, but how do we keep individuals, to what Dr. Dixon Seahorn shared, from being excluded from opportunities within our system? I think that's a much broader conversation as we reflect on policy as well. So plenty of work to do as it relates to our next study session.
Well, it sounds like we'll have a lively one.
So Donovan will be on the next study session.
Donovan will
At
be
the
on.
beginning. of
Starting
the
with
next-
that board policy piece specifically.
Yep. Okay. That moves us to 2.02, our return to learn plan.
So this morning, we wanted to bring that back to you. As you all recall, back on July 14th, we brought version 1, I believe, of our Return to Learn plan. And as we've shared with our focus groups and with the board, reentry and reopening planning really started back in March, immediately after schools were closed for the rest of the semester in early April. By the governor's decision, we started that process of reentry and reopening planning with a variety of chapters or phases along the way. A couple of updates that we wanted to bring to you this morning hit on these areas as it relates to the student census that we conducted over the course of the last couple of weeks, week and a half. Some revisions or recommendations to our Return to Learn plan that include some calendar updates, both for Liberty Public Schools as well as EPIC. In addition to that, adjustments to our learning schedules for elementary and secondary. We'll talk through those in just a moment. Some additional considerations that are on our horizon or radar. And then lastly, round out with a communication plan and frequently asked questions. Before we dive too deeply into that, just to give you a little bit of a refresher or review, as you'll recall, Kansas City, Missouri Health Department has issued guidance beginning with a joint press conference between Dr. Rex Archer and Mayor Quentin Lucas, recommending that schools not reopen until after Labor Day. That was the initial press conference. Since then, Kansas City, Missouri Health Department has kind of revisited the topic, made some adjustments, and really have kind of divided up schools into that elementary component and that secondary component based on some research, based on how the transmission of the virus is occurring at the younger grades comparative to older grades, and really leaning on the idea that elementary schools can reconvene face-to-face, while secondary schools are best suited to be able to have kind of a hybridized approach to learning, where rather than 5 days a week face-to-face, perhaps it's 2 or 3 to be able to contain capacity within a building that then allows for greater social distancing to be able to put in place in some of our larger campuses. Shifting then over to the Clay County Health Center side, following the Kansas City joint announcement between the health director and the mayor, we were waiting on an official message from Clay County to the community. A couple things that we are told is that guidance is forthcoming. We had learned it would likely be released yesterday or today, so we'll see when that gets pushed forward. A couple of key elements that it will reflect is K-5 or pre-K through grades 5 being able to resume their school year in person or face-to-face. Middle school through high school students are not recommended to start until after Labor Day, with some type of either virtual or hybrid model of attendance, and then eventually being able to return to 100% capacity over time, depending on how the virus is performing. And then lastly, it spoke to masks and face coverings being recommended for all students and staff at all grade levels, with very few exceptions. This is an additional piece to the Clay County ordinance that was issued a couple weeks ago. We spoke about that at our last board meeting. You will know that that is set to expire on August 23rd. What has been typical is that as they reach that expiration date, they revise the order or revise the ordinance that then extends it beyond its expiration, perhaps with a few changes. So we anticipate that mask piece remaining as far as masks being required in places of accommodation, either through the extension of that order or through the guidance that is released by Clay County Public Health Center. In the event that neither of those two pieces fulfill our expectation as a board and as a district that both staff and students wear masks at all times, with very few exceptions, We could certainly bring that back to the board table for your consideration in terms of mandating masks being required for staff and students. So that's something we're going to continue to watch closely. I know we had some discussion at our last meeting about that, but that's something we'll watch within the Clay County Public Health Center ordinance. The last thing that I would share, as that guidance is released, hopefully we'll see that today. There's a follow-up meeting with Clay County superintendents scheduled for Monday, August 10th, in which we will be connecting with our health services staff within our districts, as well as with Clay County Public Health Center, to walk through the guidance that they're putting out there. The idea being that Kansas City, Missouri Health Department, the county health guidance that then matches the return to learn plans that districts are putting in place across the metropolitan region. With that said, then shifting over to some census information that we've been monitoring and sharing with the board as we get updates. A couple of highlights. Our census closed on Monday, July 27th, and as you'll recall, we were asking that students and their families identify their choice following the announcement of our return to learn plan as to whether or not they intended to return fully face-to-face or whether they wanted to pursue an online or virtual only option. So as you can see, by grade level across buildings, what we end up with is 2,480 students that have chosen or elected to be a virtual only student as we move forward. I think it's important to note that albeit it sits at 2,480 today, that can certainly change. And we're going to allow opportunities for families to adjust their decision as we approach the first day of school. As they learn more information, their position may change. As we learn more data in and around the virus, transmission, positivity rates, their decision may change. And we understand that that's a very personal decision for families, and there's absolutely no wrong decision for a parent. We want to reiterate that because it truly is a very personal family-by-family decision as it relates to what their children do.
Student by student.
Student by student as well, even within the same household, for sure. The companion piece to this, as we look at it by building, you can see the students that prefer a face-to-face as compared to virtual with a grand total. Those are those first three columns represented. The percentage of virtual in aggregate is 20.61%, with one of the highest encroaching closer to 32% at Liberty Academy, and then working our way down to the lowest at 12% at Shoal Creek Elementary. This also reflects a 94.15% completion rate. Someone asked me the other day, what is our aim as far as percentage completion? It's a little different than a survey. With a survey, you're usually satisfied with 30 to 40% is a good representative sample. In this instance, we want to get to 100% so that we know what our students and families are electing to do. As of the close of the survey on Monday, we've transitioned to principals and administrative staff at buildings, connecting with their respective families for those that had not yet completed the census to be able to follow up with them, engage their election for the coming school year. Any questions over the census piece? Observations? Scott?
Just a thank you to the district, because I know parents have been all over this, anxiously awaiting what the decision is going to be today, but to have this high, our goal is 100%, but to have 95, 90, 91% complete on some of these is just amazing. So that's been really good input for us to make decisions moving forward.
A lot of work behind the scenes. So I appreciate you, Trey, and Innovation and Learning's team for doing a lot of the lift behind the scenes to get the data to us and to make sure that it's complete.
And just shout out to Liberty Oaks, 100%.
Right. I don't know. There may have been a little bit of a competition there to make sure and make all of the calls. I'm just saying. So.
Well, and I know it's a personal decision for everybody. Are there any trends within this data? I mean, we've got, obviously, to use your point, some schools at 12%, some schools at over 30%. Is there anything that's concerning as you look through this, or you guys have evaluated it?
A lot of observations,
Yeah.
I would say, as to why are some buildings lower percentage than others, both in their ability or their percentage completion, their response rate, but then also their selection rate. So anecdotally, I think there are some observations where you might have thought that some of your higher socioeconomic schools would elect to go virtual. versus your lower socioeconomic schools electing to be more face-to-face. I think anecdotally, that was our assumption going into the census. What we have found is opposite has become true. And so why is that? Why is that occurring? That's hard to drill down to, but that's certainly something on our radar as we monitor that and as we kind of try to navigate that. I also think there may be some shifting between now and the actual start of school. As we revise our plans, as parents learn more, as they get closer to that actual first day of school, you might see some shifting both directions. The other thing that's interesting here is that this does not reflect new enrollees to the system. So this is based on the students that we had last year. What we're looking at right now is to see new enrollees into the system as well as transfer out. So that 94.15% completion rate today might actually include some students that are not intending to return to the district. Similarly, as we talk with student services and their enrollment processes, there are students that are enrolling in the district, some from homeschool, some from private schools, because they're hearing those options that either their school is providing of solely face-to-face and wanting to flip into virtual, or if they're homeschool students, they're seeing the virtual, the online support that the district's providing, and they're electing to return in that online environment. We've seen that observation across several other districts as well. The last figure that I saw was we had 40 new students entering into the system who are given that opportunity to elect the face-to-face or that online piece. So as we know more, we'll share that information with the board as well.
And then the 20% seems roughly, I think, what we were thinking of, 15 to 20. How is that comparing across other?
That's a little high on our initial thoughts and our pre-survey questions that we pushed out. Even back in June, we were asking families this question. And so our initial gauge, ballpark, was in that 10 to 15%. And so early on, as we were watching that, we're like, hey, we're kind of in that range we identified, and then it kind of has increased to that 20% range. What we've seen in other districts is that there are some as low as 10%. There are some as high as 30%. Nationally, I think it's even a little bit higher if you do some national polling and surveying of families of whether they want to return face-to-face or online. I think it's also a little different on how you approach it as a district. So some districts have approached it from a messaging standpoint of, we're going to have face-to-face school. If you want to opt out, let us know, and we'll work with you. Versus the messaging and approach of, we're going to give you choice and allow you as a family to elect whether you want the face-to-face option or whether you want the solely online option. And we know there's some hybrids in between. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But that approach, I think, has resulted in differing percentages as you look across districts. Does that make sense? So we'll continue to watch that and see where those numbers adjust. The challenge is not only in building those robust online offerings, and we're in the process of doing that with our innovation and learning team, beyond what we experienced fourth quarter, and that it looks different to start a school year that way. The other piece to that is how do you staff it and repurposing staff, those that want to be virtual instructors, putting a process in place that allows them to transition successfully from the traditional to the virtual, at the same time realizing that it is different than the fourth quarter. So staffing that, and then in some instances, approaching teachers and asking them, might you be willing to become an online teacher for us and assist us in that process? We're working through that right now with our principals to ensure that we have us covered off as far as that virtual staff. Other thoughts or questions on the census piece? So then switching to one of the motion items that is included in board docs this morning is based on the Kansas City, Missouri Health Department guidance, the Clay County guidance that is forthcoming, amending our calendar to push the start date back to the first day of school being on September 8th, which is a shift for us from our previously approved calendar. A couple of high points to point out for you as far as dates. The first date for our new Teacher Institute would be August 12th through 14th, staying on course with that. Teacher in service being the week of August 17th through 24th, following the recommended guidance from Kansas City, Missouri Health Department and Clay County Health Department, and resuming school the first day of school on September 8th is the big change. As we've looked at these changes, think of your calendar that you approved back in January. Really, all we're doing is compressing the front end of that calendar and moving the start date to September 8th, keeping everything else the same. As we do that, and looking at the minutes that we have, the hours that we have by building, I appreciate Bob Citro and his team for looking at that. We're able to remain above the 1044 DESI required number of hours in a school year by doing that. And so no school falls below that as it relates to the district's calendar. Two exceptions that we're working closely on in logistics as it relates to bell schedules and so forth are the Early Childhood Center and then the EPIC calendar, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Something unique about the Early Childhood Center is that this last year was the first year for us to be able to actually capture attendance tied to early childhood students. Also keep in mind, we put in a full-time option for families. So we're working through the logistics of that, but their start date would also be on September 8th. Scott?
You mentioned earlier, you started out by talking about that the original thought was to move everything till the 8th or later or after Labor Day. But then there was some additional discussion about starting elementary kids on the 25th. So what is it about that hybrid option that we decided not to do? I'm okay with this if this is what we need to do.
Right.
I'm just disappointed we can't get going a little earlier. I was ready with the hashtag Liberty Leads.
Sure.
And not following the herd mentality, but I'm curious why we moved away from that hybrid so quickly.
So and I wouldn't say so quickly.
Yeah.
And that there was quite a bit of deliberation in and around that. Keeping in mind staff and their timing, ability to prepare from elementary to middle school, that was one component. Another big component of it is the integrated nature of our school districts. Think of it from where people reside. So I may reside in Liberty, but I work in Parkville. Or I may reside in Johnson County, but I work in Liberty. So the interconnectedness really creates some struggles or issues from an HR standpoint. And so if I am an individual teaching in Liberty Public Schools, but I reside south of the river, and my district isn't starting until September 8th, we could certainly do that. We could start earlier on the 25th with elementary face-to-face. But that creates issues for those families that don't reside in Liberty proper, because then they don't have childcare for their children because their respective district, if they're in another district, is likely going to wait until the 8th.
So it's a community syncing issue across the entire.
It's a regional issue, I would say, in part. The other piece to that is the readiness to be able to fully prepare and fully move forward with all of our options. So even in keeping with our contract for teachers, the new Teacher Institute, Teacher in Service, beyond that, time for them to be able to prepare in their classrooms, whether they're teaching traditional or virtual, or getting ready to go between both. There's the value in the added time from a teacher perspective, not only to prepare lessons for both modalities, but at the same time to be able to go in, get acclimated with the social distancing requirements, the wayfinding that we might put in place in schools, the protocols as it relates to health guidance and so forth. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done. You could split it, secondary on this calendar, elementary on this calendar. Having talked through it, the recommendation we're bringing forward is to wait and do both on the 8th, to be able to have them in lockstep. The other component to this is the family element in terms of having students that are splitting through secondary and elementary. That's going to be complicated enough as they're doing a face-to-face and a hybrid, let alone those differing calendars. So those are kind of the main reasons as to why the recommendation is what it is this morning, albeit you're correct based on the Clay County KCMO guidance, which I think is built really upon the American Academy of Pediatrics and some of the CDC guidance and research that's out there, along with Children's Mercy, allows for those elementary campuses to start a little earlier. Other questions around the LPS calendar?
Doesn't transportation also play into this? That one of the things that we've been encouraging the district is for parents that can transport their own children. And so with those schools, elementary and high school, operating in sync allows for transportation to be a little smoother, am I correct?
I think it does. I think what you would do, though, if you're starting elementary earlier on the 25th, and then you're bringing back your secondary students on the 8th, what you could do, it's kind of a gradual phasing in toward that. So the elementary piece could go ahead and get started, but then you would have to plan it with that secondary consideration in mind. Because once you hit the 8th, they're both running together, right? So you have to plan for both, albeit you're starting one a little bit earlier. The transportation piece, as you're all aware, are items that we've folded into our operating procedures, following DESE guidance, CDC guidance as well, as to how we navigate that in terms of transporting kids to and from school.
So that phasing in, if we had started elementary 2 weeks earlier than high school, you got coverage for the younger kids that are taken care of by older kids, neighbors' older kids, whatever. The first 2 weeks of school, could you then have a hangover in May where younger kids would be out for 2 weeks before the older kids were out?
Yeah, potentially, in terms of the hours for elementary as compared to secondary. The other thing you would keep in mind is by starting on the 25th, you do have that much more instructional contact hours, that many more hours in place for those elementaries as you do your secondary. On the back end in May, though, the question would be, do you compress that to stay within the 1044? That's where you end up in those two examples of elementary versus secondary and trying to have some semblance of parity. Do you amend the back end of the calendar for elementary, or did you keep it the same rolling through the end of the year? That's another complex piece. So as we think about it, you could theoretically have an elementary calendar, a secondary calendar, an ECC calendar, and an EPIC calendar. If you were to truly segment all of those portions out and run them separately, as compared to trying to limit it to 2 calendars with the district and then a separate one for EPIC elementary.
From my perspective, another reason to consider the later start is, as you know, I've been fairly critical of federal, state, and local guidance and the lack thereof that we've had. And for once, I actually feel like we've got some specifics. We're getting specific guidance that says don't start until after Labor Day. CDC is saying don't start or do distance learning until your positivity rate drops below that 5%. And as of a couple days ago in Clay County, we were over 7%. As of July 30th, I think it was between 7.5% and 8%. So this gives us a couple extra weeks to hopefully see that decline. Because as testing increases, I mean, I'm no mathematician by any means, but as testing increases, if there's fewer cases, your positivity rate should decline. So if we've got all this testing, but our positivity rate is holding steady or still increasing, that means that we've got an issue with this still spreading throughout the community at a pretty high rate. And hopefully with the mask ordinance and social distancing and people making some good choices out there, we're going to start to see that come down, and this just gives a couple extra weeks for that to occur. So I want to take advantage of actually getting guidance and using the people who are the experts in the field and not rely on the politics or the Facebook experts. And so I think that the right decision for the kids and for our teachers and staff is to give this a couple extra weeks.
And Andy brings up some of those additional considerations we'll hit on here in a little bit later, specifically around gating criteria. We've been having quite a few conversations around that, which we'll share a little bit later on. Contact tracing and our ability to put a system in place. We have a system that we utilized in July for face-to-face summer school that we feel good about, but we also know that will evolve. And it's interesting that those two examples of contact tracing and gating requirements, as of now, are being shifted onto districts to try to navigate where some of that guidance doesn't exist yet at the state level or at the local level. And so we're working collaboratively with a variety of agencies to get some type of a cohesive approach across communities, across districts, whether it be at the state or be it in the Kansas City area, to establish that gating criteria that does say, hey, at 5% and below, you're in this green status. 6 to 10%, perhaps you're in a yellow status, and then it becomes like an orange and then red, black being that you're completely shut down. We've seen some examples of that in Johnson County. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but I think Andy brings up some of those pieces that we're currently working on that we hope can be developed between now and September 8th. The value in having that guidance is how we reopen, but at the same time, as we've seen other districts that are starting virtually, at some point, they're going to need that same guidance on how they phase back into face-to-face. So that gating criteria is valuable on both ends, irregardless of how you start school. That's a critical piece. The question in our minds, however, is what's the integrity or the validity of the data? Because we know right now with testing, it can be a quick turnaround, or it can be anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks prior to someone receiving their information, or their positive or negative results. So,
Yeah, and I would just add to that, that is very valid, having personally gone through it this weekend. But I know that in our community, there's a shift being made to getting test results more quickly, so that 2 weeks will help give us more accurate information as we get closer as to what the positivity rate actually is. Right now, we have lots of tests out there that are 2 weeks old.
the other thing I would mention that gives us time to see over the course of this next month how we're doing as a community. I also have in the back of my mind, what's Labor Day look like? Are people taking it a little more cautious, or are we going to see similar activity as we saw around Memorial Day weekend and then July 4th celebration? Here we come with Labor Day.
Just last weekend,
Yeah.
down at the lake again.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want businesses to remain open and you want schools to be face-to-face, I mean, just make better choices. Bottom line. Which brings us to mass, of course, and you mentioned that earlier. And you know I'm a proponent of a mandate, and I'm comfortable with the ordinance and it's in effect, but I still want us to explore our own mandate so that we have control over where that ends for our institutions, rather than relying on others to potentially end it sooner than we think it should end for the safety of, the kids and the teachers and staff. So I don't think it needs to be action item today if the delayed start, because then it gets us out after our next meeting. But we may want to revisit that again at the next.
And now that there's that in place, I'm for that, and just vote on extending what was in place, even if they don't do it. But now the logistics are lined out in that document. I was trying to avoid having to do all those logistics.
No, and I understand. This was our last meeting before I think Epic was going to start, for example. So I
So
wanted to
I'm
bring
okay
it up.
with doing what you want
Yep.
to do, just using that old set of rules.
And I'm fine going to the 18th before we start talking about that again.
We'll
See where the
we'll
health
continue.
department's at then.
We'll continue to monitor that closely with the health department. The other thing that we brought up with Clay County Public Health Center was the understanding that their initial reopening plan, if you will recall, back in early June, it has 4 phases. Really, the meat of it sits in phase 2 with 4 steps. Step 1, 2, 3, 4. The initial thought was those could be as little as 4 weeks each, or each of those phases or those steps within phase 2 could be multiple months. We currently are hovering at phase 2, step 2. In order for schools to reopen, based on the plan, we have to move to phase 2, step 3, or the plan has to be amended. And so in talking with the executive director at Clay County Public Health Center, I know they're looking at that. That guidance is forthcoming that hopefully reflects those adjustments or those changes. So all of those moving pieces will still continue to stay close to, along with the order as we've talked about, and it being amended prior to its sunset on August 23rd.
So I appreciate the refinements that both KCMO and Clay County Health have made over the past few weeks. First pronouncement was a little bit of a blunt instrument here for the entire KC metro area, where the facts vary dramatically. We have one answer for all grade levels, but factoring in some of the science around younger kids versus teens, some of the differences in areas, I think we have an opportunity to learn together around this and refine it and get more nuanced as we go. So I appreciate KCMO revising their guide. I mean, the practical side of it was, if we're all going to start on the same day and high school isn't going to start until after Labor Day, no one's going to start early in that case. But I also think things like we have to be ready to flex measures like positivity as we get more intelligence around them. Doubling the number of tests that are done might drop that below 5%. It does not change the amount of spread within the community. It just changes the measure that we're using. So we need to get smart as we go about what are these measures about. I got 2 weeks delay. Some of the results that we're getting today, people are better by now.
Right. Or they've been walking around in the community for 2 weeks without knowing they're positive.
Right. That's shorten that.
Right.
And that, we don't do that here.
24 hours is
by
better.
ourselves.
Right.
But we've got to push Clay County and KCMO on those. And I think they are working on it, but there's a long way to go. There's
Right.
major corporations that are turning their test results around for their employees a heck of a lot faster than our community.
And I do think, just to state the obvious, but I know we have people watching at home, but we may get 2 weeks in and think, well, this is the date that we thought we were going to start school, but if the numbers are changing, we may need to pivot again. So there's just, as things unfold, we need to be prepared for flexibility and change.
That's a great segue.
Good, let's go.
In part, because honestly, as we've started this reentry and reopening planning conversation again since the beginning of April, and sharing with the governor that, hey, reopening is as difficult, if not more difficult, than the decision to shut down for the fourth quarter. As we've thought about all these various scenarios, we're starting to run short on our remaining scenarios. So as we talk about the specifics of our detailed plans here in a minute, just keep that tucked away, and that as things evolve, as things changes, we'll flex when we need to flex and communicate when we need to communicate, and appreciate the board and our community and our teachers' feedback along the way, and solicit feedback from them again if we need to. Go ahead.
Take it.
Yeah, Nick.
Go, Andrew.
I'm just looking at the calendar thing, and for some clarity, teacher in service is the 17th through the 24th of August. What is going on for those 2 weeks for teachers between the 24th and the 8th?
Following, can I turn that over to Innovation and Learning? I know they are working through that with principals. Dr. Westbrook?
So we have some plans coming out to stretch, we're going to take the 1 week that we had already planned, and instead of having it those specific days, we're just going to make it smaller, thinner bands across the learning. So we're going to do synchronous and asynchronous learning. So we'll have some sessions that run during periods of the day and let the buildings know, and then we have some things that teachers can do on their own. So we're stretching that out, and then really expect that time, because this is really a shift in their instructional practices, right? So we're going to give them time to work with their team on developing those lessons, because they have to give classroom lessons at the same time they have to figure out how to do lessons for students online. So we recognize it's just going to take some time to prepare that. This gives us that chance to do that. And we're going to guide them through the whole thing.
So will they be on-site or are they going to be hybrid as well?
Well, so there's a possibility of that. For sure, our virtual teachers have that option, but we recognize there's some value to the face-to-face team.
Right.
And then at the same time, the buildings are going to control that time, and they're really working with them on what those things look like. But part of it is that they need to be in the building working with their team. That's really part of the process, I guess.
So then are we keeping, and when we talked last time and we talked about how much time they had in building PD, we had you guys had kind of put a limit on that. Is that limit going to stay the same, or are we increasing that? Because we have
It's still
extended.
limited, because they just don't need that many building meetings. They will have some up top, in the front.
Right.
But then over time, it'll just be, the professional development the district is providing is, like I said, like a thin band throughout the entire 3 weeks, with the last few days being very limited. So we're this close to rolling that schedule out. We're just looking at exact topics, because we recognize there's some vendors that we want. We really want to work on social emotional learning. We really want to work on trauma informed. So we had to shift from that week to stretching it out to give people some more time to do that. So there's some very specific things that we're trying to reorganize very quickly.
So Jeanette, basically what I'm hearing you say is we're looking at, yeah, there'll still be some professional development, but we really want teachers to focus in on being prepared for whatever situation presents itself, whether it's they need to bone up on their virtual information, they need to get things together.
That study, I mean, really, the instructional action guide that we presented, we're really taking that apart and teaching that out, right? Because that's really why we built it, and instead of just saying, here it is, go figure it out, now we have time to figure it out. And then on top of that, honestly, they need time to work with their team on the lessons, because this is very
Right.
key. One of the things we recognize is we just shortened the first semester. So we have to figure out how to do content, we have to move over, thinking about that competency rating. You know, how can we start moving and shifting that thinking? Because as you're online, grading looks different. So there's a lot, there's kind of a lot. And then how do you start school with the virtual audience? We've never done that before. So it's really critical that we work on relationships with students and things with physical interaction.
Right.
So there's some pretty big things that we're tackling, and that time, it gives us a ton of time to do that, which I think our teachers see, but our kids need to see.
Right. I just wanted to make sure.
They have a lot.
Because I know somebody's going to ask me that question, so I might as well just ask you now.
So I promise you, Julie will make sure that the buildings are also saving that time.
Okay.
As that schedule develops, keep in mind, we had a pre-service schedule initially that we have now scrapped and going back to the drawing board. And so as that detail comes together in support of that instructional guide, as Dr. Westphal shared, we will communicate that to the board as well for your awareness. So, good question.
It will probably be, the new research slides will likely be published today.
Okay. Thanks.
Bartlow, you had a question?
Yeah, just point of clarification as I'm looking at the amended district calendar, the second sheet. Did I hear correctly that the ECC pre-K is going to start 9/8? Or does it start 9/2?
9/8
Okay.
is the intended start.
Okay.
We have some logistics that we will need to talk through to get them to their 10:44 now that you're capturing that
Yep.
early childhood attendance.
Okay.
And
It
so
shows
it's
9.
Sorry.
No, it shows 9/2 on the sheet.
Oh,
so I just,
we will fix that.
and then
My apologies.
I know it's just a typo, I assume, but LSHS should be LHS, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Okay.
Lillian Schumacher.
There's no shortage of acronyms. For
That's right.
So the only school starting a little earlier is Epic.
Yes. So if we're ready to, are we ready to switch to Epic? Okay. For the sake of time. Just to kind of walk through this one then, as you'll recall, as you know from the original calendar that was approved by the board, Epic has historically started a little earlier than the rest of the district. And so as we look to that push as well, teachers actually resumed this week with their teacher in service days. That began on August 3rd, yesterday, and runs through August 10th. If you look at the revised calendar that's in front of you this morning, pushing the Epic first day of school to September 2nd. This does give them a few days head start from the rest of the district. Keep in mind, they typically run separate or parallel from the rest of the district anyway. Those families are used to that. Staff are used to that. Gives staff some additional days as far as opportunity to prepare and collaborate within their grade level teams, content teams. A couple of other implications. It keeps the last day of school at June 11th. And then the overall hours, part of why it starts on September 2nd is because they're that much closer to the 10:44. So with that September 2nd start, their overall hours sits at 10:50.95. We've looked at 3 or 4 different scenarios, whether you start them a little bit earlier, perhaps on that Monday of that same week. If you were to push them back to that September 8th date, then they fall below the 10:44. They could start face-to-face. They could start virtually. What we've talked about is them going ahead and resuming face-to-face because it's permissible at that elementary level per guidance from KCMO Health Department and the coming Clay County guidance. So that's our recommendation as far as the EPIC calendar. If we were to do anything differently, as was shared, we'd have to go back and look at early release days, professional development days, length of their start. and their schedule over the course of each day, whether we would extend it by a few minutes. I know the goal is to get them out middle of June as compared to having them go later, because that butts up against summer school offerings for second session and just extends their school year, as we've experienced over the course of the last several years. So that is a little bit of a recap as it relates to the EPIC calendar. Questions or discussions on it?
So we feel comfortable based on health department guidance, starting elementary pre-Labor Day is okay.
As of 8:16 this morning?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Keep in mind, we're still waiting to see the finalized documentation from Clay County Public Health Center, but in those pre-conversations, we feel confident based on those conversations. To your point.
Okay. And, well, yes. This sort of gets in the return to learn plan. So if I've got individuals who are saying, nah, we're going to go virtual at EPIC, do they start the same date or do they start on the 8th?
So then, in respect to the first day of school, everybody resumes on the same day. So LPS on the 8th, EPIC on the 2nd, whether you're face-to-face or virtual.
Okay.
That is the new start date
Okay.
for all of our campuses, 2nd and 8th respectively. So yeah, that's a good point of clarification.
Okay.
Any questions then over the two calendars that we've presented to you this morning? Okay. I'm going to shift then. We do have some motion language that will follow, but I wanted to walk you through the elementary and secondary learning schedules. As what was shared on July 14th, this is a caption from that Return to Learn plan, that one-page infographic that we shared that sits on our district's website. The elementary programming remains the same. Elementary or pre-K through grades 5, both with face-to-face as well as virtual online options. So those resources are uploaded on our district's webpage. In addition, the instructional guide that was shared as well as the parent support guide, that information will just continue to evolve as we continue to trap questions, provide responses, but then also continue to develop the details in and around the start of school, whether you're a face-to-face student or whether you're a virtual student. Shifting to the secondary piece, this is what ends up being slightly different per guidance from KC Mo and Clay County Public Health Center. And that is the ability to bring students back in a blended or a hybridized face-to-face model. So as you look at this graphic, this is a graphic that will accompany our communication later today following your approval. A couple of key pieces to point out. This respective schedule is fitted around 6th through 12th grades. There are no changes, as was mentioned, to families that select a fully virtual learning option. There may be some tweaks along the way in how to engage and how to go about, courses and so forth. But as far as those families that elect fully virtual, they're fully virtual 5 days a week. In terms of the hybrid, the flexible or blended approach, it's a blend of face-to-face and virtual learning in which a student is engaged in learning 5 days a week. It just differs from day to day whether they're participating face-to-face or participating virtual. And we hope that this graphic kind of depicts what that's going to look like in terms of a day in the life of a student at that 6th grade through 12th grade level. You'll notice some groupings. There's group 1 and group 2, and the easiest way to slice that is alphabetically. And so group 1 currently is A through K in the alphabet. Group 2 is L through Z. Group 1 would attend school face-to-face on Mondays and Thursdays. Group 2 would attend school face-to-face, that's L through Z, on Tuesdays and Fridays. You'll notice that yellow Wednesday is blocked out, and so on Wednesdays, think of this in terms of all students engaged with their classroom teacher or instructor virtually. So all students attend virtually from home. Teachers will lead online instruction, engage with all of their students virtually. All secondary teachers will be coming to their school sites and facilitating instruction on those Wednesdays from their schools, from their locations. So that really is kind of the high points as it relates to that. Currently, we're working with the high school, middle school administration, and their teams in planning for what this blend or this flex or this hybrid approach looks like as far as the detail. But this is a very high-level overview of what that entails. A companion piece that we know is of interest to high school students, middle school students, and their families is how this might impact fine arts activities as well as athletics. As of yesterday, August 3rd, the Missouri State High School Activities Association put out a press release that they are exploring options. So they say they're working with schools in areas where local health departments have required virtual learning options only, and that we really have two areas. The St. Louis area, many of their districts are starting virtually only. We also know that Lafayette County, Lexington School District, they made the decision just last week to start virtually only. That then has implications on sports seasons, fine arts activities. And so initially, the Missouri State High School Activities Association issued guidance that if a school did not offer a face-to-face option, that they could not participate in Missouri State High School activities, or their seasons would be amended or changed, or they would just cancel them entirely. So we're glad to hear that the executive board is looking into that as far as options. Some ideas that they've identified per their press release include rearranging their seasons as far as postponement of fall activities potentially until later. They're also looking at the ability of schools and only offering distance learning to their students to still participate in activities, even though they're not holding in-person classes, as well as looking at regional competitions outside the traditional season once school is able to resume in person. So that's just something to keep in mind for those districts that are already only beginning virtually. In that we offer a face-to-face option as it sits right now, we would continue to move forward with activities, albeit it all hinges on guidance from our local health departments, KC Mo, Clay County. We have learned from Clay County that they will be providing some additional guidelines probably in the next couple of weeks as it relates to activities. So that's something that I know students are interested in, families are interested in. We'll continue to pay close attention to that as well. Any questions as it relates to either the elementary or the secondary learning schedules moving forward with this revised return to learn plan? We'll call it 2.0.
So the week of the 8th, what does the high school schedule look like on a week like that?
It would start like this in terms of those days as kind of our initial plan. We know it's a little different with that Monday being off. You want to speak to that, Dr. Moore? You guys have spoken about that.
Yes, so what the principals have suggested is on 4 days a week that we take out the virtual day and that we would do ABAB just to give the students more in-class time. So a lot of times we have a Friday off or,
Right, yeah, this is not the only week where this will be a
Right.
consideration.
So we talked to the different directors under school supervision and they said if we, on those days, if we communicated with parents and with your departments to say Wednesdays would then become an A day instead of a virtual day, that would be our recommendation.
So if there's a day that's off, whatever was going to happen on that day swings to Wednesday. Kind of the general direction.
And the student then could be given, in theory, a calendar that just shows, hey, this week is your AB as compared to that Wednesday. Thank you for that clarification.
And so, flipping to the next slide with the color codes, this could be a fluid situation where we might be yellow for a couple weeks of September, and then if the criteria is met, we end up switching to say green or the other direction throughout the entire semester. So it's not necessarily we're saying that we are going to do this for the entire semester or any specific length of time, right?
That's the degree of flexibility we need, yes.
Okay.
And we'll talk about the gating criteria, but even in this instance of a hybrid schedule or a flex schedule, keep in mind we're kind of shortening down our number of scenarios. So if we end up getting into a situation where the positivity rates say double or are through the roof, then that would then cause us to go virtually only.
Right.
Secondary level, perhaps at the elementary level, so then how do we transition into that? So we were talking yesterday about how you might take this 5-day schedule, this hybrid A/B approach, push it into a virtual mode, and then potentially come back into it depending on what's going on with the positivity rate and that gating criteria. So therein lies the ebb and flow as it relates to what's going on in the community as far as transmission levels and positivity.
I just wanted to make sure it was clear that this isn't saying, this is the way first semester will be, end of story. It's more of a fluid situation
Again,
depending on what's going on.
absolutely. I appreciate you mentioning that. As of today, this is our intent moving forward. So.
If I am a parent who chooses virtual learning, we'll go elementary.
Mhm.
We'll focus in there. I choose virtual learning for my student. Do I have, is my teacher what would be my in-person teacher, or is this a completely different teacher that is focused solely on virtual classroom?
Do you want to speak to that, ladies, as far as?
So there's two scenarios for a virtual teacher. One, if you select Liberty Virtual School, so those are the 2,500 students that we have that have already made that decision. They will have a specific virtual teacher that is only teaching virtually.
Okay.
So, and I can say that with 95% confidence. You might have a couple of teachers at the high school level that we're slipping back and forth
Sure.
just so we can offer more.
Yep.
At the elementary level, we've asked for, the buildings are all contributing to a teacher pool, and it's based on the number of students that they have, so equal sacrifice, right? If you have
Yep.
a percentage, 10% or 3%, then you get this many teachers, and it's according to the students you're contributing.
Yep.
So each school is bringing, and then we're putting them on grade level teams,
Yep.
so that they only have to teach one grade. Because, once we
Yes.
take them to virtual, the schools lose them.
Sure.
So it's a huge burden on both sides.
Yep. And so then the objective, obviously, with that would then be that the virtual teachers have a similar class size as we would have in a physical school. I mean, a little bit more,
Right,
sure.
because really they're not doing the student management aspect,
Yep.
right? It's just the connection, so they have more time, so they,
Yep.
we can actually put more students in there, but we're not talking hundreds.
Right.
Okay, well, maybe for special.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah,
Maybe,
sure.
Elementary specials already deals with 500.
Right.
Right,
Right.
so that's a different, I don't want to act like it's not, but classroom teachers, it's a smidge more, and
Okay.
we're trying to default to the face-to-face.
Right.
Because of the social distancing, we actually need more bodies in the building.
Mhm.
So we're letting the numbers go a little higher in the virtual side,
Okay.
but it's not unreasonable, 35, 40.
So then and I know we're allowing elementary students to say, hey, let's do it quarter by quarter. If you want to come back in second quarter or whatever, great. But, so that reentry would then be, I'm basically a new student in a new class,
Right.
right, at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we are, anybody who's, like elementary, so if we're just thinking elementary side, anybody who's teaching elementary, if the teachers from that building, all the students from that building are going in, so we can help there.
Mhm.
But obviously, if we have 11 buildings, and if there's 4 teachers on the third grade level, then all 11 buildings are not represented,
Correct, yeah.
right? So you're going to have to do.
Okay. Okay.
So, Jeanette,
Yep.
are you capping in-class sizes and virtual classes?
Yeah, trying. I mean, like, we have a fixed number of staff, right? So
Right.
at some point, the cap's going to get pushed. Right, we
Okay.
recognize that. But we're looking, actually, we were working on kind of a trigger point last night where we're watching the flexibility of size numbers. So like the elementary team, they have a document where every time a student pulls out, every day they're uploading it and watching what happens in a +1, -1 situation. So we're as good as we can be in every minute of trying to figure out. And then we're going to have kind of like the chart that's following this one, where we're watching this, let's say virtual size, where it's starting to get too high and we might need another teacher, or we might need to pull one and put them back into the physical space. So we have that system setting up. I shouldn't say it's perfect, we're working on it. And then Dr. Vogelaar has kind of a backup pool of people that we can plug in as we need them. It's not huge, but it does exist.
So then, are your class sizes on virtual a little bit larger is what I understood, correct? And if I'm a parent and I say my child needs, I don't know, geometry,
Yep.
and I go in there and it says, oops, sorry, you're done. I can't, what happens?
We won't do that.
Okay,
We are just, I mean, we're gonna meet a parent every place we can. Like, we even have some special requests that we're really trying to work through. We have some families that are doing some grouping together. We're trying to get those kids together. I mean, we're not saying no. We're saying, how can we make it work? Like, it's really stretching our thinking, but we're not saying no.
okay.
So we may not be able to do it exactly the way that they ask, but we'll get close. I mean, I'm going to tell you, Andy, it's really putting a lot on our, I mean, our teachers they're thinking big. And
I know.
I know. It's, but we're doing the
That I
very best that we
understand.
can to manage both sides and take care of our teachers too, and make sure our families can get what they need.
Epic's a little different, but not to hijack the conversation, but Epic's a little different, right? Because there's only one teacher per grade, or two teachers per grade.
Yeah, so they're managing their group in Epic, ECC, and the Liberty Academy are going to be a little bit different than the group,
Right.
right? And so they're handling their people internally because it's kind of specialized. Yeah, and so those three are actually, and we're working with them each to figure out what that looks. I mean, they have it handled, but Epic right out of the gate, right? They have it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So curriculum across elementary and secondary, whether you're virtual or in person, going to be similar. I know there'll be differences based on how things flow and management of classrooms if it's in person, but the goal is everybody's going to be roughly on the same path. Is that correct?
We're coming from our curriculum's still posted, still there, still essential.
Yep.
You know, where a lot of districts are trying to figure out how to capture that essential learning and catch up, we were actually there ahead of it.
Mhm.
So this is not new for us.
Yep.
So we really are able to diagnose where our kids are pretty quickly, figure out what they need, and put them in the right spot.
Okay.
So that's not new for us.
Yep.
New for a lot of places, but not for us.
Okay.
Any other questions on the elementary or secondary learning schedules? Again, lots of planning, lots of detail being put in place. Can't express enough the appreciation for our district level team, but then also at the building level, as they dive in and try to wrap their head around it, the teacher element, the administrative side, and really trying to put some meat to these skeleton outlines, so to speak. Yeah, David.
So help me understand at the middle school, high school level, how the schedule, the AV schedule supports distancing within the building?
Yeah, good point. And so then keep in mind at any point during the course of the face-to-face experience, so that Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Friday, you're lessening your population 50%. So that's where you end up with that A through K and that L through Z grouping, which then just makes that, not that it's ever easy, but it makes it that much more easy to navigate. You want to speak to that from an operations standpoint as far as the work you're doing in and around the readiness planning?
Sure. Not a whole lot changes from the original plan, other than we'll have a little bit more time on Wednesday, kind of getting into the spaces, and preparing and sanitizing them and the like. A lot of it just depends on what type of inspection situations we have in the building, right? That's really the control for, part of the percentage of that. I don't know if maybe I missed the front part of that.
So I guess if there's a classroom that had 28 kids in it, that teacher is still going to have that group of kids, but only half of them will show up on Monday, half of them will show up on, so we now really have 14 kids in that classroom. So within that classroom, we can distance.
That's correct.
That or-
On average.
On average, yeah, L's and K's.
Unless you have a bunch of kids
Right.
with a C last name, yeah.
So in the building, we'll have half as many kids. In each classroom, we'll have half as many students.
That's the intent, yes.
Within 3, plus if we've taken 10 to 25% out of that building because of the virtual, we're also dropping the numbers down for each one of those.
Yeah, the only other piece you would extend beyond that, particularly at the high school level, is students that are pulled out of that classroom experience, that are participating in those real-world learning opportunities. That does not go away in that hybrid approach. So your CAPS, your early college, KC Tech Academy, career centers are still moving forward with providing that face-to-face option. So then that just lessens the volume of students that you have at the high school level in particular. The other thing I would add is that principals are currently working with operations as well as their teams to be able to go in and assess and look at classroom spaces, configurations, looking at ordering desks, right, to be able to separate and social distance a little bit better than, tables that are pushed together or high top tables, so to speak. So we're actually kind of reverting back from some of those flexible spaces and learning configurations to more of that forward-facing desks, socially distanced. So more to come as we finalize those plans. The other thing that I know people are going to want to know, particularly at the elementary level, but then it's beneficial at the secondary level for social distancing, is how those rosters play out. What's the class size for third grade at Warren Hills? Or what's the class distribution, roster distribution at the high school as it relates to course offerings, period 1 through 7. So those are the pieces that we're still working through. We monitor that every year with HR's help and innovation and learning. This is, as Dr. Westphal mentioned, this is kind of a day-by-day monitoring as we get closer to the start of school to identify where rosters are. So that information will be pushed out to teachers at a later date, as well as to families in terms of their class assignments, teacher assignments as well at the elementary.
Those may not be pushed out until like right before, as we're so flexible and fluid?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
So then just to confirm, clarification on high school, it doesn't matter if you go on Monday or Tuesday in person. We're doing concept 1 on Monday, we're doing concept 2 on Tuesday, so on and so forth, right? Okay. And then I honestly think there are still a lot of people in the community, parents, who believe the virtual learning is going to be with the teacher that they would have had at their home school. And it's going to look very similar to what happened in the spring. So I don't know, as I read through this, I'm not getting that, hey, virtual learning is going to be very different from what happened in the spring. You will have a dedicated virtual teacher. It will most likely not be your homeschool teacher, et cetera. I think that probably needs to be communicated in a more explicit manner, which I know we've got in here that we're going to do different options and detailed information later, but I think that's going to impact a lot of people.
Do I want to speak to that? I think partly where that sits is that those 2 instructional guides. So for those families that are opting for virtual, that's where more of that detail sits, and that will continue to evolve. But to your point, perhaps we need to bring some of those pieces more forward-facing as it relates to future communication. So anything to add around that?
With the virtual school schedule, so the only time that it will be similar to that is if a student actually opts out for COVID quarantine, right? Where it's
Yeah.
the same teacher,
Great point.
That's going to be somewhat similar.
Yep.
So we're working on that, and we will PD that.
Yep.
So we'll make that a little bit stronger. But for people that are choosing virtual school, there's a school schedule, right? And it very much will run. We tested it in June summer school, and I'm just going to say we got pretty good reviews on that.
Yep.
Where we really do have a process that they follow for instruction that has students going back and forth between, but so there's none of here's an assignment, see you next week.
Yep.
Right? That won't happen at all in virtual school. Every day, multiple times a day.
Yep.
Building that learner agency piece where the students are able to interact back and forth, and we don't have to focus primarily on parents managing, right?
Yep.
So we're working on that.
Which totally get that and understand that. I think, just to clarify where I'm coming from, if my student is supposed to be at Kelly Brook in the 1st grade class with Mrs. Smith, and I say, you know what, we're going to go remote, I don't want to do in person, I think there are people who think I'm still going to have Mrs. Smith at Kelly Brook as my teacher, which is not a true statement.
We have a virtual school staff.
Yep. Which I think there's some confusion in the community about as parents decide what they're going to do. Yeah.
And we can work on messaging. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that forward. Any other thoughts or questions on the elementary or secondary learning schedule? So then just as a reminder, there are 2 motion items within this, one for the calendars and separate for revision to our return to learn plan.
I move the board amend the 2020-2021 district academic calendar and EPIC elementary school calendar to reflect changes in the first day of school.
Second.
Any additional discussion?
Yes.
Scott,
Yes.
Angie,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Andy,
Yes.
Nick,
Yes.
Kimberly,
Yes.
motion carries.
And I move the board adopt the return to learn plan to include the elementary learning schedule for grades pre-K through 5 and secondary flexible learning schedule for grades 6 through 12.
Second.
Any additional discussion on this one?
AJ,
Yes.
Scott,
Yes.
Angie,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Andy,
Yes.
Nick,
Yes.
Kimberly,
Yes.
motion carries.
So the companion piece as we wrap this up would be just additional considerations. So before we leave that entirely, we've talked about most of these items as it relates to contact tracing, working with county and city health departments. One of the issues they have identified is that they are not fully staffed or equipped to be able to handle the degree of contact tracing that they believe is necessary or needed. So therefore, does the district step in and put systems in place or identify teams, hire additional staff to be able to work with putting contact tracing in place? One of the things that we've identified is some actual training that's available through, I believe, is it Johns Hopkins? Johns Hopkins provides some online courses to be able to train people that are working on contact tracing. So we're working on that within our system. The other piece is, might we be able to leverage some federal dollars through the CARES Act to support a team of contact tracers? And that would be what they do on behalf of staff as well as with students that test positive or have an exposure, how we navigate that with the county and city health departments. The second piece that we've heard from both city and county health departments is the availability of testing, specifically reagents that are utilized whenever you're working with the actual test to determine whether it's positive or negative, and that there's a limited supply. So the faster we can get more testing, the better we can identify, the better we can respond, and so forth. That piece is really beyond our control, albeit we have had some initial conversations in and around perhaps the district's approach to testing. As testing either evolves, becomes more readily available, or there's another application that can be used for testing. So Steve, do you want to speak to the testing piece as far as what you've explored?
Sure, yeah, we're just actively having conversations and having a little bit of time looking at all these issues that are raised in terms of the continued readiness plan. But just testing and having conversations, we've had conversations with a couple vendors. We've also engaged public health officials in hospitals and so forth. Just understanding the importance of engaging and having some of those systems in place, both for staff and then potentially for students, and helping them kind of find testing in the right place, how to navigate it if there's a copay, just kind of all that communication that comes with it. So we're actively looking at that as we prepare over the next couple of weeks. I did also want to mention just quickly on contact tracing, since we have been in session and we have folks within the system that already have we've had a couple of COVID positive situations, so we've already had to develop a system on our own. We are responsible for our own contact tracing internally within the district, simply because as a matter of necessity, time we've had to do that. And so we already, kind of as we moved through the last month or so, developed our own system for contact tracing. We have a lot of work to do, but a lot of it just is involved with, okay, who's assessing it, who's identifying all the close contacts, are we communicating to those folks, what are we communicating to those folks? So we have a pretty decent semblance of a system in place that we can continue to grow and get ready for fall. And then the vaccination clinic, I don't know, I'm getting ahead of you a little bit. But we already have a partnership and a program with Clay County Health, and we did this back in 09 with the H1N1, where our nursing staff is deployed out within our facilities, or one or two facilities, and we'll work very closely with Clay County Health or KCMO Public Health when it is we get to the point of vaccination. That not only do we coordinate that for the LPS community, but it's really much larger than that. It's all patrons and citizens within the district have access to those facilities in that program. So the nice thing is that plan is in place. We've utilized it, and it's not that long ago. This will probably be at a higher scale when we get there, but we are already having conversations about what that might look like, just like they're aware.
And then the only other item we've talked a little bit about on that gating criteria, just know that we're continuing to advance those conversations with our 2 health departments across our region, with help from Mid-America Regional Council and the Kauffman Foundation in our 9-county area, both Missouri and Kansas City metropolitan proper, so to speak. And then last Thursday, several superintendents met with the governor, and on multiple instances, we raised this issue for our state. And whether you are outstate Missouri in a small county or a smaller districts or in a metropolitan area, we believe this gating criteria is beneficial, as we've talked about earlier this morning. The last 2 pieces then are in and around communication and what will follow.
Before we get there, can I
Yes.
go back to the
Andy,
testing? I had mentioned to you before, and I just want to make sure that we continue discussing with respect to testing and teachers and staff, and whether that's something that they're going to be, sort of on their own to seek out, or if that's something that we can help facilitate as well, since a lot's being asked of them, even more than usual. And if that's something that is financially possible and something that we can, partner with, whether it's through Liberty Hospital or something, to try to make that available for them, so it's not impacting them as financially, and also maybe help with some peace of mind that they might have for any potential exposures.
Good point. I know we've explored some of that with staff and our ability to navigate that. Dr. Vogelaar can speak to the employee side as it relates to us working with Blue Cross Blue Shield. Do you want to clarify some of what's available to staff?
Yeah, so Kevin Casey, Holmes Murphy, I had a conversation with him, and he's working on negotiating with Blue Cross and Blue Shield to contract out those services, what that cost would be, what they might subsidize or cover that cost to make that available. Like indicated, the main reason is that right now, we connect employees with their doctor, and then their doctor connects them with a testing facility to go test. And we work in 2 to 14 days, on the results, and the main difference is if the facility is doing a rapid result test or one that goes shipped off to a lab and comes back with the results. That's the main indicator of the difference between the 2. So I don't have an answer back from Kevin Casey yet on what it would cost to bring that in exclusively for our employees. So right now the system is to go through primary care physicians or through the virtual app. All of those costs are covered. There's no cost sharing. Blue Cross Blue Shield extended that cost coverage through the 23rd of October, so it pushes it out even further. And that would include also any care related to symptom surfacing with COVID-19 as well. All those costs are covered at 100% cost sharing. So I think we've got a pathway, or at least a conduit to a pathway to provide testing to employees in-house, but the cost of that is still an unknown, and so until we have that, what portion of it subsidized, the status quo is to work through primary care physicians or the virtual care app that we have.
We'll bring out additional information as we learn more.
So is there criteria tied to that too? Like you have to have exhibited symptoms or had known direct contact, or is it just, I feel like I need one because I've been around kids for 2 weeks and kind of stressed about it, and I just want to find out?
Well, right now it's symptomatic or contact tracing or close contact, notified close contact. That those would be automatics. If somebody has anxiety, wants to know, and they work through your primary care physician, you authorize for a test. That's a one-off decision between the doctor and the patient. But yeah, anytime those close contact letters go out, that's the evidence of going and getting tested or being symptomatic. We don't require the testing. I don't think that testing isn't required for close contact letters on the student side. We're not requiring that testing for the employee side, but some are in response to that.
Again, we'll message that as that evolves. So.
Okay. So with the contact tracing, I've received some comments from community members, parents. I know we've seen it in other districts. What is our, maybe obligation is too strong a word, but how are we going to talk about cases that happen? What's the HIPAA regulations, all of that, how are we addressing when a case happens in a school?
On the communication side. Do you want to speak to that, Steve?
Sure, yeah, and we've already had to do this a good handful of times thus far. So our obligation, obviously, we're connecting with if there's an individual that's COVID positive. And then anybody who's been identified as close contact within 6 feet for a period of at least 15 minutes or consecutive minutes over the course of the day, we engage that person or their family, the student, in notifying them of like what's expected of them. Mostly self-monitoring for symptoms if they're not symptomatic, right? In quarantine for a period of time, 14 days. So that's the main obligation there. What was the second part of your question?
It's just, are we going to be communicating out to the public to say, hey, look, here's the case?
We're working through that a little bit. How can we do that in a way that's disaggregated, not just,
Yep.
that kind of goes across the system. The other thing that we're trying to figure out, especially at the student level or classroom level, even if you're not in close contact, is we'll likely also offer another form of communication. Right now, we're calling it the proximity contact, because there's, the word will get out, so Billy was in close contact with Tommy was 10 feet away.
Yep.
So the obligation to make sure families understand that, but you're right, we have to be super careful with HIPAA for the line in terms of what we communicate.
Okay.
I'm not sure quite yet how we might have a reporting system whereby it's maybe a weekly or monthly report, and maybe what an obligation that we might have to share with the community what that is, and if it's just COVID positive. And again, a lot of what we're seeing, or have seen thus far, is we'll have somebody report that says, I've been identified as a close contact because my uncle who I was with, 4 days ago is COVID positive. I'm not symptomatic. What do I do? And so they have, responsibility. But then if I was a close contact of that close contact, it gets very complicated very quickly. And then what communication comes out of one of those once removed situations. So we've got a little work to do on that in communication, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yep.
And to your question, Tom Capps, legal counsel, is also working with Clay County in terms of navigating this specifically, because as it sits right now, those numbers, particularly at the student level, are small enough that they could be identifiable. And so that's something we want to make certain we're sensitive to. So as we learn more from that legal side, that will inform how we communicate forward. So more to come on that as well. The last couple pieces then on this before we leave it is our communication later today. And so you have a copy of the Return to Learn plan, a revised document that includes a message from the superintendent, a little background as to our journey and how we've solicited feedback along the way, our priorities, commitments, collaboration and partnership with a lot of those health entities we've shared, Children's Mercy, Liberty Hospital, the 2 health departments, and then the specifics attributed to our learning schedules at the elementary and secondary level. And then lastly, already preparing some frequently asked questions and trying to anticipate what we might see through Let's Talk or through a variety of emails. These are a few of those questions that we've identified. We're already putting answers to these questions in place in terms of wanting to post that information as well. So later today, we'll begin communicating that out, leading with our district leadership team, followed by our Liberty Public Schools faculty and staff, and then lastly, share that more broadly with our Liberty Public Schools families. As soon as what we've found over the last several months, as soon as we put more information out there, we get an influx of questions. And so we appreciate Dallas and his team, as well as all of our leaders at the cabinet level and throughout the system for stepping in and responding. As Dr. Westphal said, really working closely with each family. We talk about customization. This has pushed us into customization that much faster in trying to get responses to families and meeting their students' needs. So that rounds out the 2.02 item. So then the next item. As far as our budget update, we wanted to invite Cindy to the podium to really hit on a couple of quick items tied to Missouri budget withholding, federal dollars, and then set the tax rate at our regular monthly audit.
Good morning. As you know, the FY21 budget restrictions were announced on June 30th, and that included a $123 million reduction to the foundation formula. That is where we ended FY20. So we started the year out with the same reductions. What happened as a result of that in July, our state payment was paid out at 54.8%. And this was approximately $3.5 million withhold what we would have expected otherwise in a normal July payment.
Sorry, can you just say that one more time? Because I know people are watching at home.
Yes.
After all of what we've talked about, all of the work that we've done,
Yes.
what's happening with it now?
Yes, our funding as of July has been reduced or withheld because of the state of the state revenue, and that cost us about $3.5 million for July. However, based on where the state revenues go in the coming months, there is the opportunity for that to be recouped. But that picture is not clear as of today. State revenues came in July very favorably. That also, though, is in part to the extended tax payment deadlines, which caused individual revenue collections and corporate tax revenue collections to be pushed into FY21 as opposed to FY20. Yes. So,
Sorry, Cindy, so the $3.5 million, that's just out of our July.
that's out of July.
Just
That
July.
was
Just July.
4%.
It's 54.8% proration, correct. We have not been given any information on what August payments will look like yet. It is due out on the 21st. As I indicated, state revenues for July came in very strong, but we know why, so we are waiting to see what happens in August and how the next quarter really plays out for state revenues. So the finance picture will not be clear probably until after the election as where the state revenue is going. But the state is currently prorating our payment, and we anticipate that that will happen for the rest of the quarter, if not the first half of the year.
Is there a thought that this is a big chunk and it'll be prorated at a lower rate? I mean, I'm asking you.
Yeah, no, you're, and I don't have one, that
But
is
based
so
on your
true.
experience.
Based on my experience, they wanted to, well, not based on my experience, based on what we have been told,
Right.
this is the biggest chunk of the withholding that we will experience from the state. Unless revenues continue to fall off, and it becomes clear that the revenue shortfall that is anticipated will be greater, and then we could see a bigger dip in proration. It's anticipated that the whole proration could be about 5% over the year. So I don't anticipate that August will be prorated at 54%.
This is a little different than what we saw in 0708. So think of it as being front-loaded in July rather than a month-to-month reduction.
Right.
So it's not to say that that can't happen, but even in conversations with the governor on Thursday, he articulated that rather than make it more difficult for organizations to plan month-to-month, for school systems in particular, do it in July, watch it, and if you're able to recoup revenue, then that proration changes to your advantage in terms of additional revenue as compared to what we saw in 0708, where we saw reduction after reduction after reduction.
So we feel a little better about that because we now know that we can expect a more stable revenue stream throughout the rest of the year instead of being able not to anticipate what each month's payment will be. So, yes, we hope, yeah. Subject to change, just like we ended the year very differently than we had anticipated.
I've seen it play out.
No, no, this is new
Remain
territory.
optimistic.
It makes it fun job to budget and try to figure out where we're going to be. So we won't have the payment at the next board meeting yet, but hopefully I will have more information to share with you what we might anticipate that could be. So more to come on that for the next few months. So we'll keep you updated as we get new information as well.
And my cynicism is not hurt.
I understand, thank you. The second thing I wanted to talk about briefly was the CARES Act funding. And as you know, we received 2 pieces of CARES Act funding. One was through DESE, through the CARES Act money that the secondary and elementary schools were allocated. And of a there was a $208 million allocation to DESE, our district received about $315,000. Clay County was also given CARES money, and of the CARES money that the county received, we received $1.2 million of that. So of CARES money that was allocated, the district has received about a total of $1.5 million. To date, we've spent $921,000 of that, and we have another $935,000 encumbered to be spent. So all in all, when it's all said and done, to date, we will have spent $1.8 million. So there's a little bit of a shortfall between what we've received of 1.5 and what we've already obligated ourselves to spend of 1.8. To that degree, we are working to try and partner with the City of Liberty, who has some funds that they received through the CARES Act that they may not be able to spend. So we have put in a proposal to them to pay for the student desks that we know that we are going to need of about $243,000. So that will go to the mayor and the city council in the coming weeks. It looks favorable that we should receive that, though, so that will be helpful, and that will almost get us up to paying for everything that we've spent to date through the CARES Act. That would leave us about $100,000 short. But then that brings us to the coming opportunities that we may have to see some additional funds. There are 3 DESE grants specifically, 2 for transportation and 1 for a supply grant that were just announced last week. So the information specifically how to apply for that and what the parameters are, and that will come out later, hopefully this week, from DESE, so we'll know if we are able to apply for it and what we might be able to get toward that. Also, there are 2 proposed acts right now in front of Congress. One is the HEALS Act and the other is the HEROES Act. And the HEALS Act has $70 billion slotted for K-12 education, and the HEROES Act has $58 billion slotted for education. Keeping that in perspective, the CARES Act had $13.5 billion slotted for education, so it's quite an extensive addition to what may be available. They're debating that. Both of them are allocated on student census population and Title I to some differing degree between the 2 acts. For the HEALS Act, the thing to note that's important is that 1/3 would be available immediately, and the other 2/3 currently is proposed to be tied to some form of in-person learning. So there are criteria around it, could be 50%, so there's quite a few things that go into that 2/3, so that's in that proposal. So we'll see how all of that shakes out, which one shakes out, and what the combination of the 2 of them look like. But those are in front of Congress right now, so I don't have an expected date on that, but there could be more funding coming our way, because we do realize and recognize that we know we're going to spend more than we've already spent to replenish supplies, to provide PD money for our teachers to develop the curriculum for Liberty Virtual, just the unknown things that come about that we don't even know that we're going to need at this point. So we know that there will be more expenditures on the horizon for us for that. But we're
City with the CARES Act, the big bucket that.
Yep.
We've spent most of that, or maybe all of that, on kind of supplies and
Yep.
getting the schools ready.
Correct.
Welcome students back in the midst of this.
That is correct. Totally correct. And at last board meeting, I did provide in my report a breakdown of what we had spent that on, and I will keep updating that as we keep spending in my monthly report, so you can see what we have done with that. And the last thing we could potentially have funding for still is the FEMA grant, if we choose to go that route, if all of this runs out and figure. FEMA, yeah, FEMA grant through the state and federal agencies. So that kind of wraps up what I know today about what's coming down the CARES Act chute with the new two things on the table. The last thing I wanted to talk about real briefly was the tax rate. And we've talked at our last board meeting about this, that we did get our preliminary numbers in. We show a 1.66% increase in assessed valuation, which will generate an additional $1.4 million in revenue over the prior year at a 97.79% collection rate. I'm hoping we get our final numbers next week. We need them in order to have our tax rate hearing at the next board meeting, which it is scheduled for the 18th at our regular Board of Education meeting. We will have no change in the current tax rate. The distribution will change by less than a penny from debt service to operating based on the ability to move between those two, but it will look much like the prior year as it sets right now. Now, typically, those numbers do change a little bit from the preliminary to the final numbers, so as soon as I get that, we will have updated numbers for you. And that's all I have for you today, unless you have some questions for me.
Questions?
Thank you.
The last item then on 2.04 is remaining cabinet updates. So wanted to provide an opportunity for cabinet to be able to report out any quick updates that they might have. So innovation and learning. Dr. Westfall or Dr. Moore, any updates from you all?
So, just from our perspective, as you know, July 31st, we finished summer school face-to-face. So one of the things I want to give a shout out to Christopher Hand and Lisa Johnson, because they really walked through quite a few different scenarios that helped guide us in our planning. We weren't necessarily thinking through two summer schools when we thought about it back in January, and so we had, our virtual experience and then our face-to-face experience. But we had pretty good results from that. So I would say thank you to them, and then all the site directors, and most especially our teachers who, jumped in there. We created a few Facebook superstars out of this that have helped us really understand what it looks like in the classroom, and really did some exciting, innovative things with our kids. The second thing is, Julie and I have been working, starting in the month of July, but July into August, deciding what innovation and learning looks like in our department, and just redesigning some things. We had our directors retreat on July 31st, brought the whole team in and just started looking at what kind of contributions that we could do together and how we could work side by side to work building the department. And then Julie also organized and had the principals retreat on the 30th, so the day before the directors retreat, and they really spent a lot of time working on the plans that we saw today for the retreat. That was a big part of that conversation. And then, last but not least, some upcoming information. Just wanted to share with you, Mr. Meisenheimer is working, so the backpack return to learn process of getting school supplies out is still going to happen, and it's coming on Monday, so just right around the corner. And it's going to be at Liberty North High School at the drive-through process from 11 to 1. So that's just kind of exciting. They're getting their team together to prep everything and then pass it out. So that's pretty much it.
Questions of innovation and learning, Dr. Westfall or Dr. Moore? Thank you for that. Next up then, equity, Dr. Dixon Seahorn, anything to add?
Just wanted to reiterate what Dr. Tucker had shared about the upcoming virtual symposium that he and I will be a part of, hosted by Suburban Balance. They are a community entity, and they work with a partner with Suburban Districts, and so there will be private and public school districts represented by way of district leadership, and it's also crossing the state line. So we'll have districts such as Blue Valley, Shawnee Mission, New Summit, obviously Liberty, and St. Teresa's Academy, Great Neck. So these are district leaders that will be a part of this larger conversation around really three large things: equity and the parent/family of state equity. So the questions, as Dr. Tucker mentioned previously, when we were talking about DEI, they're asking some tough questions of district leaders about these three topic areas. So we're going to be hearing today, been tapping into various stakeholders within our system to get some answers to some of the questions that they were braced enough to provide to us in advance. And so we're very excited about being part of that panel on this Thursday. I think it will be via a Facebook kind of live mode from 7 to 8:15 on this Thursday. And then in terms of the next steps for me, of course, we're in the process of compiling the data from the equity talk, and then also moving into departmental and school leadership conversation pieces with members of those building leadership teams or the management teams within other departments that are non-academic. And so we'll be having some conversations around cultural competence, cultural relevance, cultural responsiveness, unconscious bias, and then also calling out unconscious racial bias in those conversations. So those district leaders and school leaders, we think they came up with equity talk, and they're very excited about what we're really doing in this work. That's what we have for the month of August and September.
Questions of Dr. Dixon Seaholm? We heard from business services. Anything else to add, Cindy? Thank you for your update. Operations, Mr. Anderson?
Sure, just real quick, construction-wise, there's no significant deviations to the work in terms of schedule, budget, or design. Nothing really to report there, other than if you're over there during the coming days, you can see they're starting to peel off the top of the atrium area. And as a reminder, if anybody wants to see what those projects will look like when complete, they're in that monthly report, that construction update. So feel free to share that as well. And then I believe you received a message from us within the last few days. We've got a couple of meetings coming up pertaining to incentive commissions and so forth. So Liberty Commission meetings next week. We're also meeting with Casey Moe, Casey Public Schools on incentive reform. That's also next week. And then we're tracking a potentially large project, a Senate project, not TIF, within Liberty, over 3 million square feet in along South of the Parkway. Have reached out to the city. They've agreed to connect with us here, hopefully in the coming weeks, to get a better sense of what that proposal is about. So just that you have that on your radar, and that you have to take into account.
Questions of Mr. Anderson? Lastly then, HR, Dr. Vogelaar?
Yes, so communication is going to be happening today, a lot of communication with regard to virtual teaching assignments. Dr. Westfall has gotten a list of the assignments that are ready to communicate. There are still a few openings, but we decided that we would wait to communicate virtual assignments to fill the remaining spots, but just to get that going. So 104 people applied for virtual teaching assignments, 101 of them as of today, so we do have some that voluntarily withdrew. We imagine some of that will happen after this new plan is communicated. We may get some others that have opted to stay in. So, but we'll be sending out letters to those folks, and to the folks that aren't selected for virtual learning. We're communicating with them as well, but the communication is that it's no at this time, recognizing that things may continue to fluctuate and change. So those letters are slated for later this morning to go out. Leaves and accommodations, my department's working diligently with those. We anticipate we'll start seeing more of those requests as we get closer to the school year from our summer attempt to acquire as many of those potentials as possible. We've gotten 34. I don't know if you remember in the board meeting, it started at 19, grew to 21. There's 34 in there now. 21, we do anticipate actually having some lead protection of the 34, but so far no paperwork is in there. I think that process continues to work through. We're also working very closely with Kelly Educational Services just to make sure there's a readiness for the return to learn. Right now, Kelly Services has 770 subs in their pool with a goal of 850 to serve both North Kansas City and Liberty. It's hard to know whether that's going to be enough or not, but they've got some incentives planned and anticipate somewhere between 40 and 50% participation rates based on their survey data. We have doubled our dispatch subs, our emergency dispatch subs, just in anticipation of that. We've asked for 20 of those, 19 are filled, and Angie and I had a conversation about that, confirming the identities of 19, so we have more this point, we aren't sure if we will distribute those across every building or try to put the emphasis at the elementary schools where that's going to be face-to-face and maybe double up those dispatch subs from there. Wherever the need is, they fan out, but if there isn't a need on any given day, then they stay and provide service to the school. So that decision is still being made as we speak. I mentioned earlier the COVID coverage from Blue Cross is extended to October 23rd. So all of that is really the need of the hour work of the HR department, but we are looking proactively as well. Some changes with Title IX that go into effect on August 14th. Will be a policy in our employee handbook, so the revisions will be looked at. MSBA is working on a policy ACA that when they release that will come to the board for the first read and second read in the normal pattern, but that will affect probably most dominantly, it will affect the way and who will provide services to investigate inquiries that come with regard to violations of Title IX. And then we're working very closely with Dr. Moore to train all building administrators on LGBTQ sensitivity. That's been an initiative and a priority for a while, and so in October there's a training opportunity for our building administrators this year to do that. We're bringing in a specialist who actually is employed in the Parkdale School District, who's done this in Parkdale, but he trains as a part of the group that's designed to open up dialogue and communication with kids who might be feeling isolated because they can't go home and talk about what they're going through with mom and dad, but they also maybe feel like they don't have peer groups or adult relationships to open up to. So it's a way to create or improve a pathway for communication to adults who are in their life for the purpose of caring for them and meeting their needs. So that training is coming up in October. I'd be glad to answer any questions. That's a basic update of what's happening in the HR department right now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Nan.
How many subs were in place last year when we started? Do you know?
Between in the pool between both North Kansas City and us was right around 4.
Okay.
How many, any idea about virtual teachers, how many you will actually need or an estimate at this point in time?
Yeah, I think it was 40, Jeanette, the virtual teacher demand is 44. Right now, yeah, we're trying to fill 40, and I think there's 16 that we're still holding spots for.
We have about 35 or so, elementary level only. Still have a couple of spots that we will.
All right.
Yeah, of the 101 that are interested in doing it, so less than half.
High school, we're waiting on student population.
All right.
Ready to hire.
So it'll grow.
And we also imagine that if it will change, some parents will say, now that I know what face-to-face is looking like at the secondary level, maybe they'd like to switch from virtual to face-to-face, and so that may impact what that demand flow looks like as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes our cabinet updates for this morning.
Right. That brings us to the end of our agenda. Have any parting comments or a motion to adjourn?
Go vote. I move to adjourn.
Thank you. Election day.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Go vote. All right. So we have a motion?
Move to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
AJ,
Yes.
Scott,
Yes.
Angie,
Yes.
Angie,
Yes.
Okay.
Nick,
Yes.
Kimberly. Yes. Motion carries.
Thank you all.
Say we are adjourned and
Oh, sure.